We'll go ahead with the next slide. My name is Paulo Gurisco. I'm a certified safety professional working as a safety manager for Bell Construction and a certified aging in place specialist serving the Nashville community as board secretary for Rebuilding Together Nashville. Next. I'm also a very proud member of the ULI Nashville Building Healthy Places Action Council. If you're interested in contributing towards efforts to make our city healthier for residents, employees, and visitors through thoughtful design of built environment, consider becoming a member of the BHP Action Council. And you can contact ULI Nashville's Executive Director, Jennifer Carlett, for more information. Her contact information is there for you. Next. The Living Well, Aging Well Power Hour focused on the transformative power of universal design and its application across a variety of project scales with a focus on housing. This session will highlight how universal design goes beyond the scope of ADA guidelines to create environments that are truly accessible, inclusive, and functional for people of all ages and abilities. For this morning's agenda, we will hear from our guest speaker, Richard Duncan, followed by question and answers. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Duncan, the Executive Director of both Universal Design Institute and the Better Living Design Institute located in Asheville, North Carolina. With nearly 40 years of experience in architectural and product accessibility, universal design, and community planning, Richard has dedicated his career to improving the built environment for people with disabilities and older adults across residential, public, and transportation spaces. Richard has an extensive background in accessible and universal design, including cost, materials, and product development. He has played a pivotal role in advancing industry standards and was instrumental in creating certifications such as the Universal Design Build course and the Certified Aging in Place Specialist course. These contributions have further solidified his reputation as a thought leader in the field. As a certified aging in place specialist and universal design advocate myself, I can confidently say we are fortunate to have Richard here with us today. Next. While you're hearing from our speaker, we'd also like to hear from you. We're going to ask the audience to stay muted during the power hour, but feel free to send questions in the chat feature at any point. We'll collect them along with some questions from ULI members for a robust question and answer QA session at the end. Next. Without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to our speaker, Richard, who will lead us in this conversation around universal design and aging in place.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you for that kind of introduction and your interesting graphics. I didn't know you were going to pull up my affiliated graphics for that. That was fun to see. Thanks for inviting me to speak to this group. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to ULI members and get to know ULI a little bit better myself. I'll get this fired up here. So if people can see that, then we can get started. So what we'll do today is try to give, in a very brief amount of time, the something of a history of the field of universal design. So some of you may know it, some of you may not, some of you may have been involved with it. Talk about the demographics of design and how that's influenced its progress to date and what will be happening going forward. A little bit of a snapshot about where I see accessible and universal design being now. And then, of course, we'll talk about a whole lot about different kinds of universal design features in various environments, give you some exposure to that. A little bit about what we see is happening in the future, and then a fair amount of attention as this list was developed on different kinds of resources that you may be able to tap, some from us, some from others in your work going forward. So we hope to cover those in some depth and help you with that understanding. So as Paolo said, we'll be happy to talk about questions. So I start the clock on this country's attention to things design-wise that were for folks who weren't within some kind of normative range back to 1961, where the A117.1 standard first came up. And of course, as people know, that's undergone revisions, periodic and intentional over time. The most recent one was in 2017. Another one is pending. And we're happy to have that still as part of our kind of national landscape for this work. In the 60s, along with a lot of the other civil rights movements, disability rights became a big thing with lots of protests because of the reality of the built environment back then, happily significantly changed at this point, which promoted state laws and federal legislation along the way that we're trying to do a better job. I'm skipping over a whole lot of intervening pieces of legislation in the interest of brevity here. So we'll skip way ahead to 1988 with the Fair Housing Amendments Act. As people probably know, it addresses exclusively multifamily housing. It's still in place. We'll talk more about kind of how that's progressed since then a little bit later. And then kind of the big dog here, which is in the passage in 1992 of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, has a very significant footprint, both from a design and construction perspective, as well as kind of metaphorically in the American accessibility consciousness. So those are three elements that affect the accessibility of our built environment then and now. And the focus in the 20th century, when all these came up, was on accessible design. That was brand new back then, the second half of the century. And people didn't know what to make of it or how to handle it. It was brought about in part by the increase in the numbers of people with permanent disabling conditions due to a lot of unfortunate circumstances prior to that. But the demographic that we pointed to back then was, 20% of Americans have disabilities. That's a
Richard,
big number. Yes.
apologies, Richard. I can't see your slide. Was that?
Can you not see any of the slides?
No.
Oh. Well, then it didn't work. So it worked when we tested it, but not now?
Correct.
Okay. So
Yeah, we just
then
see you, no slides.
well, I mean, many would say that that's a fair trade, but I don't think in this context that that's appropriate. So I'll back out, and I don't know that I'm going to just back in. Why don't I close this, and maybe I'll come back into the presentation.
Would you like us to share it, Victoria, so that you could share from our end?
Well, we may. Let's give it one more shot and see if that doesn't work. Then that's really what we have that escape valve for, right? Is to get that to happen. So let me see if I can give it one more trial and see if I can get that to come up. So that's not it. We'll close that out, and we'll do this. And then we'll see if we can rejoin. Now that doesn't work. It says that screen sharing has failed to start. Maybe someone needs to toggle something for me. I'll try this again. Go to here. Are we seeing anything now?
Yes, sir. We are good.
Okay. And all right. And now?
Yep, still good.
I don't know what happened. Sorry about that. Well, there's our agenda. And you'll see we will talk about all those things, as I said. And here's my little graphic and my chart that shows the protesters as well as the three, very significant contributors to accessibility in the built environment there. Here's my fancy graphic showing a pie chart. Let me know right away if things go wonky on this. Anyway, so there's the old pie chart. Now that demographic is a little bit closer to 25%, still significant, but it got people's attention back then, and I think the advocates in the field got elected officials' attention back then, which is what created some of the legislation that we're still living with today. I think to the benefit of all of us. As I said, the emphasis was on accessibility and people with what I would call as big D disabilities, folks who used wheelchairs primarily, people who were deaf and people who were blind. Because wheelchair users and the elements that they drove, in a sense, in the design area was most significant. And you'll see, and as you've probably seen in even your work, even today, mobility issues drive a lot of design decisions that we think actually are quite beneficial to lots of folks, which is one of the fundamental underpinnings of our conversation today. So this is really, one of the main kinds of graphics that were shown back then, and you could even show it today. And the question was, is there a good reason why this guy who uses a wheelchair to get around cannot travel to the places that the other people you see in the background can? Why can't he get up to those places? And the answer was, there's no good reason. There are reasons, but none of them good, none of them sufficient. And so happily over the past 40, 50 years, those reality have changed so that this guy will likely find either a ramp or a gentle sloping surface somewhere nearby where he can use that. I'm not sure that guy is. I think he was a model that we used. That looks like our old red office wheelchair. You'll see it again. So we do simulations where we need to. So at the beginning, when people were just trying this out, there were a lot of different solutions tried. A lot of them, not very good looking, really. Things like this tack-on, add-on ramps, which surely made a big difference in the lives of the folks who were able to take advantage of things like that, but really didn't represent anything more than a finger in the dike, as it were, for actually the kinds of things we're trying to achieve and that we have achieved since then. So happily, this is not what we're limited to now. We can do a much, much better job. This is, one particular kind of a ramp situation in buildings, and ramps are still around. They'll always be needed at some point. And that's our friend and architect from Brazil, Marcelo, who's modeling for us. And it shows one advancement in the field is where you have ramps. It's great to have the origin and termination of the ramp be the same as the origin and termination of adjacent stairs. Stairs are fine, no problem with those, but not having things be so distant. You may remember back in the olden days, good ramps were afterthoughts and step-free entrances were afterthoughts. You had the ramp that could be way over there or way in the back, and the regular entrance, so quote unquote, with stairs would be in the typical location where other people would be using it. Here that shows kind of some progress in that area. So we're happy to see that. We'll show other slides later on that will reflect what I think is probably your experience, although maybe not, and how we've done a better job with that since then. So there were lots of advances in terms of in the landscaped environment, in building entrances in the urban environment, and so on, but also inside buildings. So all these regulations and standards that came into play got very particular in some areas. No more specific than in restrooms, where we have specific things we have to accomplish, and that the bathrooms of old, which had compartments, as you see kind of in the upper right here, that were standard, then we said, okay, we need to have larger ones to accommodate folks who use wheelchairs. One advancement that's more universal these days is the recognition that both right and left-handed transfer toilets in bathrooms with a sufficient size are a great idea, because everybody can be right-handed or left-handed. Another advancement since then has been the inclusion of what's so-called the ambulatory accessible compartment, I think promoted primarily by AARP and the needs of their members, which I am a member of myself, is, pardon me, not so much space, but support bars really close to the body, which is much more useful for older adults in getting on and off toilets in many cases. So that's been included since then in larger bathrooms. And we'll talk a little bit more about restroom design and its advances going forward, but we've made some progress in that area happily. So the status now is we have a 117.1 again with the 2017 edition that's out there that's incorporated into most state and local building codes via IBC or in a more odd way in even the IRC that deal with mainly, multifamily and non-residential in various ways. Good stuff. We like to have it be developed. A117.1 tends to be the accessibility reality in our life that is updated much more frequently or at all in some cases, and to I think the benefit reflecting thinking that is going forward. Fair Housing Act, as we know, is just multifamily. It's doing okay. We like kind of where that's brought us to much more useful and usable housing in multifamily housing that's been built over the past 35 years than it may have been otherwise. We can do better. We'll talk a little bit more about how we're going to be doing better with that later on. And of course, the ADA, mainly non-residential. It does have some residential type elements within those standards as well. Fair Housing has not been updated. Actually, colleagues of mine created the Fair Housing Act design manual, which you may be using. We wish that it would have an update because it's desperately needed. We don't see that happening anytime soon, unfortunately. And the ADA would also benefit from some update too. It's 2010 is that standard, the Fair Housing Act, with some exceptions. It's kind of frozen back in the 90s. So here we have our friend Marcelo again, and what we began to see, what practitioners back in the 20th century began to see, was a phenomenon that seemed to be compelling and convincing to them, and was certainly convincing to a lot of other people, which is the fact that 95% of the users that they saw, these elements of the built environment that were supposed to be benefiting these folks with significant disabling conditions, were in fact other people like, I can attest to this, families with strollers taking advantage of this, and a whole variety of other folks we'll talk about as we go through this slideshow. I can attest, being a parent of a child back in the kind of pre-ramp days in Boston, of hauling, strollers up and down stairs, subways, and what a pain that was. And surely it would have made a bigger difference for our lives if we'd had features like this in the built environment. So they saw folks like this and many others using these elements that were supposed to be for this restricted group of folks. And again, the pin started to drop in terms of what are we doing here with design. I was at a conference in New York long ago and visited a street intersection that had curb cuts at all four corners. So ramps were an element that were required increasingly. Curb cuts were eventually required in lots of places. And likewise, this accessibility element, as I noted then, and as many of you may have noted yourselves out in the worlds that you occupy, mainly used by people who you wouldn't think of as having a big D disability, including, let's say, this older woman here. Clearly, she could have stepped up on a curb if there had been one. Clearly, she's better off not having to do that. Her, tripping vulnerabilities, I think, are more substantial at her age than when she was younger. And because it's just a kind of background to the built environment now, she doesn't take notice of it, nor do most of the other people in these photographs that you'll see here. So, cyclists were happy that they're not riding their bikes on the sidewalk. So they're walking their bike. They could have easily lifted up over the curb, right? But don't have to. That's a good thing. You can imagine kids and their bikes that they're walking along might do the same thing. And here's our strollers again, obviously coming from some kind of a festival or birthday party. And the not very well maintained curb cut, I'll note here. This is one of the real challenges with a lot of our accessibility features in our built environment, maintaining them over time so they still work as they were intended to. More strollers, this time a real heavyweight one here, a double stroller, right? Would have had a more difficult time getting up and over that curb edge had the curb cut not been there. Then someone with what looks like an empty shopping cart or laundry basket, easy to manipulate now, not so easy later on when it's full. Surely appreciates that without maybe knowing it. And delivery guys, one of the surprising elements of the introduction of all these accessibility features in the built environment over the years was the huge benefit that the delivery people gained from it and how they expressed their appreciation for it. I mean, initially, these folks had no idea this was put in for other people. They thought it was being put in for their benefit, and they were extremely grateful for it. And we all take advantage of this now, right? How about us with rolling luggage? Couldn't manage nearly as well in built environment that didn't have set free routes of travel. And okay, finally, in my brief time there, here's someone, yeah, this is for whom it was intended, and happens to be an older person as well, riding a scooter, and someone else being pushed in a manual wheelchair. Those are folks for whom, getting up and over would be nearly impossible without these features. So one way you get to kind of the universal outcome in our world is with ubiquity of something like curb cuts and its common use by lots of folks, it fading into the background of people's consciousness, but everyone takes advantage of it all the time, of some needing it much more acutely, others much less acutely, but surely a benefit, as I think people will agree, to everybody. So we're kind of evolving into a universal design mindset. And this is what people were noticing back then, that it may not be so useful to think in terms of design for normal people over here and design for the special small group over there. Something else was afoot. So after 25 years, beginning in the mid-1980s, guys like Ron Mace, after whom we've named our institute, who was a practicing architect back then, who wound up at the College of Design, which is where I worked with him, began to think more seriously about what was going on. And he coined the term universal design, which first appeared in about 1985 in a magazine. And that began kind of a snowballing effect with him and others in the field joining together, and finally in the 1990s coming up with the first kind of codification of the principles of universal design, which we'll speak very briefly about later on. There he is. And then others in other places, including academic settings like Rhode Island School of Design, dealing more with product design and kind of near environment things themselves, and others across the country were beginning to deal with this stuff. So we had the accessible design elements happening all along, beginning in the 60s and still continuing to this day. And then what arose in the mid-1980s and on to now is this universal design idea, which is a more integrated, maybe transcendent idea of the built environment. It's, design of all products and environments to be used by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation, and especially without the need for specialized design. More stuff built in as a matter of practice, and less stuff tacked on that's specialized for particular individuals. Not entirely possible to avoid, restrooms being the prime example in all cases, but surely something that's achievable in large part. So here's my fancy graphics for this presentation. 7 principles. We won't go into any detail on these, but I'll show you some examples as we go through. I'm not going to go through an academic recitation of these, but I'll just I'll bring them in a few times, and you can see on your screen going forward how it's going to look. Over those 30-odd years, it's found its way, universal design has, into a whole variety of different fields. Obviously, architecture and interior design, landscaping, and so on, even urban planning, as we'll talk about later. But also, interestingly, things like graphics and communications and education, starting from a similar perspective, treating kind of special needs education on the one hand, realizing now that, wait a minute, a lot of the things we're kind of reserving for special ed really can benefit a whole variety of folks across this whole diversity of learning styles. And so we're happy to see that happening as well, especially since I'm seeing my grandchildren themselves going through school. I'm glad that some of those things are in place that wouldn't have been, and surely weren't when I was growing up. Likewise, the beneficiaries are much broader. I've already telegraphed this to you all, and you'll see more of this going forward. But it's not just folks, big D disabilities, who use wheelchairs or scooters, or people who are blind, or people who are deaf, but folks with a variety of mobility issues who use mobility aids or maybe don't use mobility aids. It could be hidden disabilities that limit their ability to get around the same as others. Folks who are inattentive. You think about these chirping elements at intersections that are supposed to alert blind folks that the light has changed. Well, they also alert all of us who are staring into our phones that the light has changed as well. So we're beneficiaries, not just blind folks, but folks with low vision. So an attention to lighting and signage matters, and not just people who are deaf, but people who are hard of hearing. So introducing multiple sensory alerts, both auditory and visual, is where we're thinking really has a universal design outcome there. People with circumstantial disabilities, we'll show images of this going forward, is that you don't have any other particular health issue, but you've got a circumstantial disability because the activity that you're involved in at that moment disables you. And certainly folks with a variety of temporary disabilities, including pregnant women, frankly, in the later months of their pregnancy, people can attest to how you operate differently in the world, and perhaps can take advantage more of some of these features we're talking about. So yeah, families, as we indicated before, and when you percolate this down, not just to the outside environment with strollers and bikes and so on, but to housing, which we'll also talk about today, this can be a real benefit for families of all ages, young or old. And here's folks, this is probably weekend warrior. Maybe he was in this cold weather skiing in some ski resort and fell down. Even for the period of time he is, it's you all know someone, maybe you've had the same situation yourself, where you can't go up to the second floor of your house where the bedrooms are, so you're camping out in the living room or otherwise inconvenienced by other elements of the built environment. If you didn't have these features, how much more difficult would life be? The Segway has I don't think has maybe still around as much as they had been before. For a while they were all big, but none of those devices could have operated at all if we still had all the impediments in our built environment that we had 40 years ago. But certainly these are growing in popularity. I wish I'd invested in the scooter industry 30 years ago. Given our demographics of aging, more and more folks are using these, and these are made usable by these elements in our built environment that have come about because of the accessibility requirements that are out there. And then there's, of course, the guy who was maybe originally intended for, whether it's in his home or other housing in the built environment. All these folks are included in the beneficiary group of a more universal approach to things. So the other demographic that was quoted back then and still quoted now is that, not just the numbers of folks who have a disabling condition at a given point in time, but the fact that we're likely to join that club very much over our lifespan. So the number they used was 70% of Americans have a disability at some point. I think that's a low number. I think it's closer to 100%. I think that with respect to aging, which we'll talk about more in a minute, you're going to either be aging with a disability or aging into disability, with very few exceptions. Those exceptions are options that we don't want at all, because you're not aging with or without, you're not aging at all. So it means something even worse has happened to you. So I'd recommend that almost all of us at some point in our lives will experience a way of dealing with the built environment that isn't as we have been. And that just broadens the constituency for the stuff we're talking about even more. It's not something we keep paying attention to. You've seen a million different graphics showing what the aging population looks like and how it's going forward. And this is one that I find particularly compelling, because it shows the 85 and older with the green and the 65 and older with the blue line, really tiny numbers more than 100 years ago, when the life expectancy was 47 on up to 2050 and now beyond. It really isn't going to peak until, I think, the 6th or 7th decade of this century, at which point, unless we mess things up, it's going to level off. So happily, we'll be able to anticipate going forward, lives where we're born and have a really good chance of living to be ripe old age. That should mean something from a design perspective. And where we looked at the disability demographic in the 20th century as being the thing that really drove a lot of thinking, now it's the aging demographic in this century. In fact, even bigger numbers, more sustained forever, virtually, and so should really have profound effects. So we're beginning to, I think a little late, deal with what does it mean from a design perspective in all areas to design better for older adults. So as I was kind of telegraphing before, in the non-residential built environment, we've done a much better job as people have taken the basics and the bare bones of accessibility requirements and rendered them in a more design integrated way So it's kind of had, in some respects, kind of universal outcome without intending it to be so. But people have realized that you don't need to have separate and different. You can have combined, where everybody can take advantage of these features. So that's a good thing. In the multifamily area, people have also done a much better job. I mean, for a decade or so or more, compliance was very limited, and we think that multifamily for a long time is an option that maybe is under considered for folks who can't find better designed housing in other housing sectors. And because they have, some accessible units, some fair housing units, and the others are not. But accessibility and the facilities on the grounds with the amenities and so on. So they're doing a much better job of accommodating. They can do better. It's the 1, 2, and 3 family housing area where the needle has not budged nearly as much. Some, but not as much as in these other areas. And that's really the focus of a lot of our attention these days, is how to get that done differently, so that we're not having to contend with older adults living in places that just don't work for them. Because we live in all kinds of housing all over the place, in your communities and elsewhere, none of it virtually designed to allow graceful aging or safe aging or independent aging. So we're stuck with this existing infrastructure, and it causes problems. They're becoming places rapidly where we can't live safely or independently, with all kinds of individual problems, household problems, family problems, and then community problems, which we can talk about in a different presentation, with not that many alternatives. I mean, with multifamily being a big exception, and some of the age targeted options being other exceptions. And remodeling being as challenged as it is. It's not the case that we can all just remodel our homes and have them work great, because remodeling can be a real challenging area to be operating in. It's there. It's one of the things we pay attention to, but we need to, be building new in different ways as well. So that's one of the challenges for the Nashville area. So lots of different household compositions with older adults, various kinds. These guys actually, they're octogenarians, I think, all of them now. One of them is sadly passed away, the guy in the back, Charlie Watts. Now, I don't know what their needs are. I can bet that it's different than it was 60 years ago, even though they still seem to be dancing around on stages. That's good. But even these guys will need some kind of accommodation in their housing at some point, if not now. So we think from a housing perspective, in this 1, 2, and 3 family housing perspective, it is indeed a hair and fire emergency. And I'd commend you to, as you can, is to take that sense with you and see in the Nashville metro area if things can happen more. So again, I'm throwing some design principles in here. The real message is really the images and the design issues. We have our stroller again. We love our strollers because everybody likes little kids in strollers, with your typically wide doorway and a step-free entrance here. This tricky little image also shows the side light. We love side lights, full height side lights beside doors or windows that are adjacent, so people who are tall or short or seated can see who's at the door. And this also has this little tricky thing where the side light is hinged as well. So this is not the first time you'll see movers taking advantage of this, and how much they'll like this. Weather protection of doorways and housing, and we'll spend some time in the housing area now before we get back into the non-residential environment, makes a big difference. And this was actually a retrofit. It had a stoop and stairs before. Now it has this lovely entrance that surely added value to it. New construction house that shows a gentle sloping pathway, porch that's level with the first floor. Well, again, weather protection, which is so important in universal housing. And unfortunately, no handrails on the stairs, which we wish were there, but pathways that are firm, stable, and even. Here's our mover again. They'll give you a discount, as I discovered, not having to climb stairs. So keep that in mind next time you have movers helping you out. Front controls on stoves or cooktops is a great thing, because you don't have to reach over the hot cooking items or burners to reach things. Smooth stovetops is probably a good idea as well. And they made advances in that area as well. And even better would be design that actually connects location of the knobs, which is the location of the burners. Tough to do. It's for some reason we have a hard time doing that. More models are coming out with these features now, but that would make a big difference too. So handrails on stairs, just basic things. Stairs in homes are fine. We don't mind them because we can do other accommodations for folks, as you can see if we do another presentation on housing. But it certainly it makes it safer. Handrails on both sides of stairs. They're hand shaped, so you can take advantage of it and grip it firmly. As well as in this case, we did some experimentation with differential shading of the nosing of stairs, so that when you're descending, you have a better sense of the depth perception that's going on. So visual environment as well. Kitchen design's been coming in the direction of universal design for a long time, with all the various options and combinations you can pick from various kind of elements, including the front controls, as I mentioned, under counter mounted microwaves, some kind of seated knee space, which is very frequent in kitchens these days anyway. Drawer bases makes accessing things easier, or even pantry style storage of various kinds of descriptions gives you visual and physical access in a kitchen environment. We love front loading control and front control washers and dryers. They were interested in the market, as well as some other elements you see later on, for having nothing to do with flexibility of mounting or ease of use, or visual perception or ergonomics. It's really for saving water and cleaner clothes. But that's okay. They came to a universal outcome from another perspective. You'll see another example of that in a couple of minutes. And then bathrooms, many different ways you could craft bathrooms or work better. This is a little bit of a stretch for some folks, but a 3-fixture bath with step-free, curbless shower, bench for sitting if that's needed, handheld shower, as well as a tub. So you can have all those elements in one area. We've done a lot of work in that area as well. So with respect to residential, which again is so little of this happening even yet, they're high function, they're livable. They need to be highly marketable if they're going to be successful in universal design, and allows that to happen, even though it has these high functions. And importantly, the customizations of folks living in those homes is very small. It's really adding grab bars and some detailing things we can talk about another time, but it's not the same $85,000 price tag that a lot of folks might be needing to look at. Really for everyone, and by definition, if you're building a universally designed home, you're building an age-friendly home, and age-friendly really is one of these touchstones for us going forward. Okay, leaving housing behind and going into the macro built environment. Norway as a country has adopted universal design as a national standard and a principle to be designing towards it. They've even gone so far as to kind of flipping the script, where in public spaces, I think this is part of their subway system in Oslo, the primary routes of travel are always step-free, and you can choose to, as the left-hand image shows, go to the place that has stairs, but that's not the primary route. They've really made that their maximum emphasis, and I recommend that in other projects of various sizes. Outdoor recreation areas have been subject to a lot of provisions over time. You can make them more universal in this case by expanding, again, thinking about who the users of these spaces. You typically think of, well, you have kids with disabilities that use wheelchairs. Absolutely, they may have some of those folks. It may have parents with disabling conditions, and so designing it so that it's accessible to them will make a difference. Or I think even more frequently is grandparents accompanying grandkids to playgrounds and outdoor recreation areas. They need to be kept in mind, including simple things like how much seating are you providing? Kids need seating sometimes, so do grandparents and others. That's a simple thing to do that comes out of the universal design, I think, perspective. In this case, lowered counters are required for accessibility reasons. There's lots of different ways that's been rendered. We'll show you some other images later on if we have time. And in this case, it's a lowered counter here with knee space. These counters slide back in under the higher counter, and it actually acts as the gateway in and out for staff into the space as well. So they've cleverly designed this so you get all the advantages and of the lowered counter for lots and lots of users, but it also has a double purpose. So it's really, this is one of the airports. Lighting, particularly in home environments is a really issue because we underlight most of our home environments. So that's a thing we spend attention to. But in terms of perceptible information, thinking about different ways to provide information about rooms within larger buildings, how they're designated, how they're communicated, is something that demands, I think, some greater attention. And this is one scheme that's been developed that has colors, shapes, braille, as well as raised letterings and so on. So that's an area we can spend more attention to too. So I described earlier how you can come to a universal outcome practicing accessibility in a more sophisticated way, or just through the use and utility of various particular accessibility features like curb cuts. In this case, we've come to a universal outcome by attempting to accommodate totally different kinds of needs of folks. In this case, we'd call these folks people with circumstantial disabilities. Their ability to, grab a handle, turn it, grab a knob, open a hinge door, so on, very compromised in using stores. All stores have this now, of course. And here's someone who has even more bags, right? So even more compromised in their ability to manage otherwise. I mean, these automatic opening doors were introduced into supermarkets many years ago when I was a child to accommodate people like this lady. They couldn't have people shop with their shopping carts and not be able to get out of the store and get to their cars with them. So it was really for goods that these step-free routes of travel and these automatic opening doors were developed. And lo and behold, it's people with circumstantial disabilities of various kinds and workers of various kinds as well. Again, workers often are helped and aided by these features. And there's someone with a temporary disability, right? With a cast on their leg, taking advantage of this as well would have been much more difficult to handle it without these motion tagging things. And there we go. There's the guy with a cart and someone using our red office wheelchair, again, as you can see, who's able to use that more effectively. So really, they came to a universal outcome without intending to, but we're happy for that anyway. So lots of examples these days of gentle sloping pathways, elegantly designed interconnected pathways that provide the ability for families as a group to be able to travel the same paths out in parks and recreation areas, including around buildings and arts performance spaces, and still in some cases like the lower left, with the retrofit of existing buildings, you've got some significant grade changes that they've managed to overcome with a long gentle sloping ramp. We're up in the upper right, which is more of a staged photo showing all these folks using it, but still ramps in some places might be needed if you can't accommodate them otherwise. But happily, we're seeing less ramps in new builds and more gentle sloping interconnected pathways, which is a good thing. So outside and entrances to buildings, all common routes of travel where everybody comes and goes, automatic opening doors, step-free entrances, very few hazards in many of these places, as well as outdoor spaces. I think the lower left is actually one of the monument sites in Washington, D.C. that just shows, both the stairs, a couple of stairs here with handrails, we note, as well as a gentle sloping pathway. So you can include stairs in these schemes without compromising things. From a more kind of transportation urban design perspective, this is, I think, well, we've probably all been in this situation at some point. We had to cross a street that was not designed for pedestrians at all. And I don't even see there's any crosswalks at any point there. Anyway, so trapped in these car dominant environments. So clearly we make common cause with, walkable communities, complete streets type approaches to things where pedestrians are specifically included in the design of these areas, which also benefit, of course, older adults and may take longer to cross streets, people with various disabling conditions, and kids. And in this case, you see kind of the before picture of kind of a standard community and looks like it's, a more southerly state, and how much better and nicer it is with something around about it might have been optional, but it certainly slows traffic down. And you have crosswalks provided, more trees in the environment, sidewalks included, how much the property values are so much improved by including these kinds of features instead.
Thank you, Richard.
I'm mindful of the time, Paolo. Are we
All right,
running
yeah,
out?
It is. Okay, so it is 9:15. So as soon as we can, we're gonna move into these question and answers. Do you have another slide you'd like to get through?
I do, and I misread the agenda. I thought that we were 10 minutes away from that. No, we have 15?
Yeah, apologies for the confusion.
Okay, so it's my fault. I do have a few more slides, and I won't take up too much more
Okay.
time in going through them. So we will race through these. So getting that to building interiors, the hands-free elements of building interiors in restrooms are becoming, in many areas actually, more and more common. Again, not approached from a universal design perspective is really to save water and heat and money. That's fine. This is kind of a more state-of-the-art accessible restroom rendered in a kind of nice way. But one of the challenges going forward is how do you make bathrooms that are more useful for older adults? These standard McDonald's restroom type style things really don't work as well for older adults, just certainly in terms of grab bars around toilets. And the kind of gender issues in restrooms is also coming up with, you can separate the toileting from all the other things. Is that possible to do? And we'll bypass this. That's the same basic issue with partitions and partition height. We see these lowered counters in reception areas also doing a better job as they've been more integrated into the overall counter and reception areas. You'll see I'll talk about office in our future look going forward, and I'll leave you. I won't leave you with this, but I'll interrupt with this. Is people use universal design now in a lot of unfortunate ways as being the same and synonyms as all these other things. It really isn't, nor is it a euphemism, some attempt at giving some blanket. It really is a special approach design. So I'll ask you to contemplate that going forward. So in terms of future trends, clearly what's different about design for aging, the whole neurodiversity area with autism spectrum folks and developmental disabilities and a variety of other cognitive conditions that need to be accommodated. We're just getting a handle on now. I talked about, we show restrooms. There's a lot going on in these areas. COVID really advanced the hygiene issues that make common cause with universal design, as well as multi-generational issues. And in office areas, I mean, this is an area we've spent some time in. How do you, now that the ADA is controlled kind of macro issues, how do you negotiate lighting and temperature, sound, air quality, and individual workstation design? Those are areas I think we need to spend more time working on. So here's our family of man photo, and the notion that understanding that variation in human form and performance is ordinary and expected. Kind of that's where we're at. I have a lot of resources which we'll put into a package and send off to our friends Paolo and Victoria. So we'll get those to you going forward. But there's stuff we've published, stuff from the Architectural Landscape Association, and from other areas. I'll mention this maybe later on if we have questions in terms of what are you going to be pointing at to get the job done. There's the LEED and the WELL stuff, WELL building standards. People may be familiar with that, and stuff on our website. We're easy to find. We've just published a lot on this. A lot of it's in housing, a lot of it in other areas as well. So what I hope you got from this is, that the disability and the aging demographics have driven an urgency for this, but really aren't the reasons for paying attention, since there's so many other human conditions across our lifespan that demand attention. We're doing a better job with accessibility and including universal design from an accessibility perspective along the way. That universal design still has not found its way into any codes that we're aware of. Some of the resources and references I made just a couple seconds ago may edge us into that, and we recommend those. And just a reminder as we sail off here is that universal design is not a synonym to ADA compliant design or accessible design. It does go beyond, and it has a whole different both process and we think an improved result from that. So sorry for that mix up, Paolo, but there's our time for questions, and I'll bow out of my slides.
All right. No worries,
we can
Richard.
see
Thank you
this.
so much.
Okay, sure.
It's visible, it's evident in the chat that those slides were very appreciated, regardless of time. So let's transition now to questions from our audience. We have a few that have been submitted, so feel free to add more if you'd like. Starting with the first question. All right, have there been any major lobbying efforts towards legislation to regulate or mandate incorporation of universal design principles in single-family home design and construction?
Not that I'm aware of nationally. And I think that, the effect of the disability demographic and the action in the 20th century kind of put some emphasis on that then, without a whole lot of effect in the mainstream market-based housing sector, with the exception of things that we're anticipating the aging phenomenon, and that being an effect, which is that age-targeted housing has done a better job in designing better for their clientele. Remarkably, for decades they didn't spend much attention to that. That's done a better job. But on the local level is where I think a lot of the action is, in terms of pushing more universal design standards, and that's happened in various ways all over the country. We're doing a lot of work now in the Kansas City area, as it turns out, as well as some efforts here in the Asheville area. So nothing national, but really is local. And it may be up to folks, for instance, in the Nashville area, to kind of take this up and to promote this. And we're actually publishing a book that's coming out this year on how you can, what local ordinances look like, how you can adopt them, and what are the strategies you can get for adoption and for success in that area. So stay
Great.
tuned for that.
All right, another question. Could you please speak to the cost of adding universal design features to development? How much is it already baked in because of industry standards and regulation?
Well, in the non-residential multifamily built environment, it has already been baked in. There was a lot of thrashing and gnashing of teeth as these statutes were enacted and as they were implemented initially. My sense is that there's lots and lots of building types that wouldn't consider going back to the olden days in deference to cost savings from whether it's grading or equipment or attention to details of design they wouldn't have otherwise. So that's already been baked in, which is why in the non-residential area, it's not such a stretch, to say, okay, we've done this, let's do a few more things that's mainly intentional and mainly, as I think a lot of these approaches identify, planned from the beginning. I think you find a much different situation with respect to housing. Housing is kind of where the rest of the built environment was back in 1980 in terms of their thinking about it and what's baked in, because very little is baked in, and the question's asked all the time from the housing sector side, not so much from the non-residential built environment. My answer for that is it depends, which is not helpful, but it talks to the complexity of the answer. But 0 to 5% is my general, almost equally unhelpful answer. It depends on what kind of housing you're building to begin with. If you're building townhomes, you have no hope. We spent time in looking at those. If you're building other kinds of housing, the distance between what you're doing now, other kinds of housing, is not such a big deal. And really most of the cost comes from figuring out how you're going to get people in the front door. That's the biggest design engineering and cost challenge with housing.
All right. Thank you, Richard. And we have time for one more question from Julius Sutherland. Have you seen or addressed challenges regarding disaster or climate preparedness? In other words, access to tornado or storm shelters?
It comes up often from the disability community and now from the aging community, and we've experienced it, as people may know, in Asheville in the fall. And most of the emergency places people go to are accessible. That can vary from place to place, but they've been designated, kind of for that reason. A more long-term issue is or medium term would be the temporary housing that people might be directed towards. That's more of a challenge. I'm not quite sure why more what kind of accessible or universally designed homes like that aren't just kind of standard, not knowing who might be needing this on an emergency basis. Longer term, there's really an issue with, do we just raise buildings up 15 or 20 feet in lots of places, either at coastlines or along rivers, which is the problem that we had here. And you could certainly do that if you're accommodating people's use and utility of those buildings on a kind of a block-sized basis. If it's building by building by building, very difficult to, unless it's a very large building, to get access up and down all the time. But if you're considering it in aggregate, you can attempt solutions that that can address in an economical way both the long-term sustainability of housing in certain or buildings of various kinds in certain areas, if you're rebuilding there at all, so they can be used long-term by more folks.
Okay, well, thank you again, Richard. Thank you very much for joining us today on the Power Hour. Your insight was very valuable in helping us to understand how universal design can influence the lives of many in a meaningful way. So I'd like to take a few moments here to highlight local organizations incorporating universal design aspects in their work here in Nashville. Move on to the next slide. One being the Metro Housing Trust Fund. So the Barnes Fund requires units to be accessible by all people while maintaining aesthetics and affordability, requiring 10 criteria to be utilized in units and or common areas. The Civic Leadership Forum, the Civic Design Center. The Civic Design Center mission statement is to advocate for civic design visions and actionable change in communities to improve quality of life for all. They also use public engagement in various projects to ensure diverse community voices are heard and considered in the design process. So I'd say that definitely aligns with Principle 1, equitable use, that Richard shared with us today. And finally, we have Rebuilding Together Nashville. Rebuilding Together Nashville provides critical home repairs and accessibility modifications for low-income seniors, veterans, and individuals with disabilities. The work aligns with universal design and aging in place, creating safer, more functional homes that support independent living. Next. I want to invite everyone to imagine for a moment that the next person who walks through your door, your workspace, is someone with a different ability, age, or perspective than yours. How can you make sure that what you created isn't just designed for you, but for everyone? Let's take a moment to think about how universal design can be woven into our daily lives. So we're not just building for today, but for a future where everyone can thrive. Next. I challenge you also to think about how universal design can be incorporated into your current and future work. Through early integration of these principles in the planning and design stages, so on and so forth, we can definitely help to influence built environments to serve everyone today and also for future generations. Before we let you go, I want to let you know of an upcoming ULI Nashville event. The ULI Nashville Civic Leadership Forum's virtual power hour on February the 14th. A love letter from regional planning, collaboration for a better future. In this insightful program, planning leaders from the cities of Clarksville, Franklin, and Nolensville will come together to share their expertise and discuss the unique challenges and successes that come with managing both urban and suburban growth. Go to ULI's event page to learn more. Thanks for joining us this morning to learn foundational information on universal design and aging in place. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And thanks again, Richard.
Thank you all. Nice to meet you.